Are you still curious about DDCs? Do you wonder, could a digital-to-digital converter actually help the sound of my system? Whether you want to spend a little or a lot, there are many options that could suit your needs. This is my second video on the subject, and I have some worthy contenders for your consideration. There are three primary benefits of a DDC. The first is galvanic isolation. That means make sure that noise in your source, oftentimes a very noisy computer, does not make it through to the DAC. Second option, it deals with reclocking, making sure that the signal is as perfectly timed as possible. And finally, there is interface conversion. A lot of times you might have USB coming from one device and perhaps the DAC doesn't accept USB. Or what I've discovered is that I2S is oftentimes the best sounding option for a DAC to receive, but there aren't many things that will send I2S. So the DDC can convert from USB to I2S. I'm going to be talking about 4 different DDCs in this particular video. The first I've discussed before is the very inexpensive SMSL PO100 Pro. We're also going to talk about the very expensive Denafrips Gaia. And we have 2 new ones we're going to mix into the fray. The first is the LAiV Harmony Micro DDC. The last one is the Douk Audio U2 Pro, specifically the XMOS XU316 version. Why do we need all those letters and numbers? It turns out there are 2 versions of the U2 Pro. There's the XU208 version, which is the one I mistakenly bought first, and the XU316, which has better features, can handle higher sample rates, that type of situation. If you're enjoying this content, please press that like button and feel free to subscribe if you'd like to continue watching my videos into the future. I really appreciate it. In addition to the DDCs, I'll also be talking about various different HDMI cables used to transfer I2S. The HDMI cable was chosen by PS Audio because it was suitable to carry the I2S information. Of course, now we have a lot of confusion as to whether that HDMI port is I2S or surround sound for your television. Not the same thing. Be careful not to connect them because they are incompatible. Let's consider these units for their appearance and construction to begin with. The SMSL PO100 Pro has a metal case and it's quite small. I was surprised at how light it was, and it would be very easy to hide it back behind your system somewhere. The Douk Audio U2 Pro also has a metal case, but it's approximately 2 to 3 times as big as the SMSL. It's substantially heavier and denser, and I think it's designed more to sit on a shelf. Power for it also comes from the USB, just as it does with the SMSL PO100 Pro. I really like the look of the micro DDC from LAiV. It's a very solid little block of aluminum, very heavy, nicely compact, and my one disappointment here is that it doesn't come with an internal power supply, although that does provide an opportunity because we can try using other power supplies for it. And finally, the Gaia is made of plates of aluminum panels. It's very heavy, very solid, and it does come with its own built-in linear supply. Most DDCs tend to have a single USB port. That's certainly the case for the SMSL PO100 Pro and Douk Audio U2 Pro. That's perfectly adequate if your music source is something like a PC or a Mac, possibly your phone, maybe a Raspberry Pi. Some streamers like the EverSolo have USB output as well, so it works very well for that. In my case, I have multiple digital sources and they don't all have USB as an output. Therefore, I would prefer something with more inputs if I could have that, and that's one of the benefits of the micro DDC from LAiV. The micro DDC has an interesting collection of inputs. It has USB, RCA, SPDIF, it has AES EBU, and interestingly, it has an I2S input. So you could have a separate SACD transport that sends I2S into the micro DDC, and then the micro DDC sends I2S onto your DAC, which probably has only one I2S input. The one thing that's missing, though, is an optical input. There's no Toslink connector, which I thought was a little bit odd that it wasn't included. The Denafrips Gaia has USB, SPDIF, coax, and optical, as well as AES EBU, but it does not have an I2S input. When it comes to outputs, the SMSL and the Douk audio both have I2S and two kinds of SPDIF, coax and optical. In the case of the micro DDC, it's a bit unusual. It has just one output, I2S. That does limit you in terms of what DACs you can use, but if you do have a DAC with I2S, you should get very good results. The Denafrips Gaia has I2S. It has two kinds of SPDIF, coax, and optical, and it actually has two AES EBU outputs. You can connect this to a Denafrips terminator, and using those two outputs together, they can be bridged so that you can actually send higher than 192 kilohertz per second in terms of your sample rate. It's a little bit unusual, but is quite handy if you want to exceed the normal SPDIF limits using AES EBU. The challenge with comparing things like DDCs is the differences are not major, even though fundamentally they can have a significant impact on your enjoyment pleasure. To make part of this possible, I have the benchmark LA4 preamp, which lets me set the input level of each input within 0.5 dB. I know that they say you can tell the difference between a 0.1 dB, but I'm not listening that closely for a difference in volume. I'm listening for a difference in character. So that is my preamp, and then to make this work, I happen to have two virtually identical Ferrum Wandla setups. Here's the Wandla itself. This particular one, I believe, has the version 3 main board with the Hypsos power supply. Up here we have another Ferrum Wandla. This one has the version 4 main board with, again, a Hypsos power supply. The difference between 3 and 4, I've been told, is not sonically different, but I do occasionally swap these back and forth once I think I've got my results, just to confirm that it's not being swayed by version 3 motherboard versus version 4. When comparing DDCs and also DACs, I find a quick switch back and forth between them won't necessarily highlight the differences. It can't be 2 seconds, 2 seconds, 2 seconds. Your brain really needs a chance to wrap itself around, what am I listening? What is the character of that thing? In the past, I typically would need anywhere from 30 seconds to a few minutes to get a sense as to what I was hearing and start recognizing things that I thought were different and significant. If I noticed something that I thought was special, I would then go back to the other one and listen specifically for that aspect to see if that was unique to one or the other. A lot of times I'd think I'd notice something and then I'd go back and listen to the other one and discover that, oh no, it has that too. But in many cases, I would hear some aspect of it and go, that's really not on the other side. I encourage you, if you are doing similar testing, don't assume that you can just go click, 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 click and notice immediately the differences. It really does take some period of time to wrap your head around what is the thing I'm hearing. I decided to start with the big boys, the Denafrips Gaia and the LAiV Harmony Micro DDC. It took me a little while going back and forth, slowly teasing out what I thought was the difference. And I finally came to the realization that the Gaia did sound better to me. It was a bit more fleshed out, a bit more liquid. This was most noticeable in the reverb of vocals, almost like an additional shine or brilliance. The reverb had more texture. You could think of it as a blooming flower where the petals, as represented by the Gaia, were just a bit more exquisite. I wasn't ready to call that settled. Remember, the Micro DDC comes with a wall-wart switch mode power supply. I know switch mode supplies can be very good. I've had some in some of my own builds. But a wall-wart? I'm sure we can do better than that. One of the challenges is that it needed 5 volts and 2 amps. To have very good regulation with 2 amps of output is a little bit of a challenge. The first one I tried was a supply that I'd created for a Raspberry Pi. It had a good toroidal transformer, a full-wave bridge rectifier, some smoothing caps, and a basic regulator circuit. It was a linear power supply, able to do 2 amps and 5 volts. I hooked it up to the LAiV Harmony Micro DDC. It did not improve it. Going from the crappy switch mode supply to the DIY supply didn't make a difference. Could it be that the supply really was good enough and that the Micro DDC was just not as good as the Gaia? The next supply I tried was from AliExpress and I got it for about $100. But even though the price was low, the quality seems very high. It has an R-core transformer, much better smoothing than I was using in my linear supply, multiple layers of filtering, and what surprised me the most is a TL431 shunt regulator. So what happened when I hooked it up to the Micro DDC? I was pleasantly surprised. That little power supply elevated the Micro DDC to be basically the same level as the Gaia. There are still some very minor differences in character, but I would say that I would be exceedingly happy with either of these options at this point. Not everybody wants to have to go out and buy a separate supply. Not everybody wants to buy something from AliExpress, but there are many other options out there for very good power supplies. Just remember, it needs to supply 5 volts and 2 amps. And of course, have the appropriate barrel connector, but that part's pretty standard. My next comparison was the LAiV Micro DDC with its original switch mode supply versus the SMSL PO100 Pro. It should be noted that the Micro DDC is about 12 times the cost of the PO100 Pro, so this is definitely a Davy and Goliath comparison. And the SMSL definitely did not live up to the Micro DDC. I noticed that it had a bit of a blurred, smudged feel, sort of things had like soft edges to them. Rather than the reverb sounding brilliant and glowing, it was kind of dull and muted. When I played very busy rhythmic sections, I found they sounded a little bit jumbled and confused. It made me feel just a little bit edgy listening to them rather than just being able to settle in and just feeling them flow. In comparison, the Micro DAC had much more clarity. It was much, use the word pluckier, a better sense of motion. It was tighter. It felt more comfortable listening to it, more natural. And as I say, I'm not surprised because there's a massive difference in price here. And the next phase was a much more fair comparison, the PO100 from SMSL and the U2 from Douk Audio. And this I found really interesting. I went back and forth for a long time, listening. And these were essentially identical. I had a really hard time distinguishing anything of note of one versus the other. Every once in a while I think, oh, is this maybe a bit fatter sounding here? And then I'd go back to the other one and said, no, it's the same. Is this a little bit more brilliant? No. Is the texture nicer? No. It didn't matter what I did. It always seemed to sound exactly the same. So then when it comes to choosing between these two, it would really come down to features, and even their features are similar. They've got the same inputs, the same outputs. Both of them are powered off of your streamer. The PO100 Pro does have 2 I2S modes. So if your DAC doesn't have the necessary adjustments to work with it, that could be handy. I believe the PO100 also has MQA support, which can be useful if you want MQA. I don't know many people who still do, but it is there. It's also smaller, easier to hide out of the way, which can be a nice thing if that's how you want to use it. Or if you're carrying it with you, it's much lighter weight, and you could actually have it in a portable system if you want, or in your car. In contrast, the Douk Audio U2 Pro is larger, it's chunkier, it looks really good sitting on a shelf compared to the PO100 Pro, which just looks like some little thing there. And the one thing that I really like about the U2 is it has front LEDs that show the sample rate that's being inputted to it at that point, and I found that quite helpful and pleasant. So I would say I probably prefer the U2 just for that. But again, it depends on whether you want something small and handy and hidden away, or whether you want something sitting out and telling you what's happening. So that comes to the end of the comparison of the DDCs themselves, but I'm not done yet because I was also comparing cables while I was going through. My initial comparison of the micro DDC and the Gaia revealed a difference that seemed too pronounced somehow. Enough so that I wanted to double check to make sure that my test was valid. I went through and checked all of the elements, all the connections, and came to the realization that the one distinctly different element was the HDMI cable. The micro DDC was using a Blue Jeans HDMI cable, while the Gaia had an AV Play HDMI cable. I didn't know a lot about that cable, but I thought they're obviously not the same. Let's swap them. Unfortunately, I didn't have two cables of the exact same kind that I could use. After swapping them, I found that some of the performance change had moved. Suddenly, the Gaia wasn't nearly as much better than the micro DDC as I thought. In fact, it might actually be about the same or possibly even worse. I didn't spend a lot of time listening at that because once I recognized that the issue was the Blue Jeans cable, I pulled it out of the equation and I substituted in a AudioQuest Forest cable. I redid a bunch of my tests, swapping those two cables back and forth, and confirmed that they were pretty much neck and neck. I think perhaps the AudioQuest Forest might be very marginally better, but both of those cables are about $70. So for the purpose of my tests, I felt like it was valid, and every once in a while throughout my tests, I would then swap them again just to confirm the differences that I heard were valid and not due to the differences in cables. After having learned about the performance inadequacies of the Blue Jeans cable, I wanted to try one more test. I ordered a Snow Kids 8K 1.5 foot cable from Amazon, and I compared it to the Blue Jeans, and for all intents and purposes, they're pretty much the same. Neither of them seems distinctly better than the others, and both of them prevent the Gaia, for example, from doing that wonderful blooming reverb thing that it did so nicely with the better cable. It does make me wonder why the better cables work as well as they do. Is it that they've got silver in them? This is a standard cliche that I've often heard, that silver cables are better for digital. Perhaps that's true. Unfortunately, I can't find the AudioQuest carbon cable that I have here somewhere. The Forest has just 0.5% of silver, whereas the carbon has apparently 5% of silver. So if silver is the magic bullet, it should make it that much better. So I'll keep hunting around, and if I can find it, I'll do another test later. So in conclusion, yes, DDCs definitely make a difference. It's not a massive difference, but sometimes that little bit more takes your system from being mundane to magical. Sometimes that extra little bit is all you need to just perfectly fall in love with your system. And cables make a difference too. Now, of course, the irony here is that the better quality cable is about $70, and $70 is what the two cheaper DDCs cost. So I would say if you're going with one of the cheaper options, probably just use the cheaper cable, because it doesn't make much sense to use a $100 cable with a $100 DDC now, does it? So what's my recommendation after all of these tests? If you don't mind spending the money out of the box, as it is, the Denafrips Gaia is the best of the bunch. Not only does it sound the best, it also has a wide range of inputs and outputs. The only input it doesn't have is the I2S that's on the micro DDC. Next up is the micro DDC from LAiV. It's less than half the price of the Gaia, and it has pretty much the same inputs, although it doesn't have the optical and does have the I2S. So that may fit your use case better. There's only an I2S output though. So if your DAC doesn't have I2S input, then the micro DDC is not for you. And note that it can sound just as good as the Gaia, but you have to find a very good aftermarket power supply. If you're comfortable buying something from AliExpress, that could cost just $100. But if you're going to a company like Teddy Pardo, that could cost you $500. So be aware of that. If you want to really get the full performance out of it, you do need a better power supply. If you're not comfortable spending that much money, and if you have only USB coming from your source, then either the SMSL or the Douk audio units will be fine. In my case, I think I prefer the Douk audio. I like the appearance and the heft of the unit, and I really like the LEDs that indicate what the sample rate is coming into the unit. The SMSL sounds identical to the Douk audio as far as my testing showed. And it has 2 different I2S modes if your DAC has an issue with that. And it's also a bit smaller if you need to hide it away. So it really depends on your own use case. If you're still curious about DDCs and you haven't taken the plunge yet, my suggestion is, as a proof of concept, buy one of the cheaper ones from Amazon, the SMSL or the Douk audio. Set up a test. Now, hopefully your source has both USB and SPDIF outputs. That is optimal, because if that's the case, then you can connect your source's USB output to one of these devices and then go from that device to your DAC. And then you can also take your source's SPDIF and go directly to the DAC. So now you have one channel without the DDC and one channel with. And then go ahead and change back and forth to get a sense of the differences. Experiment with shorter switching time, longer switching time, and try just maybe ignore it for a while to see if it suddenly makes you notice it for some reason. I find that's a particularly good test. If you don't think it's helpful, then return it, get your money back. But I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. And then you can decide, do you want to actually spend more money on one of the bigger units? But ultimately, I think you do need a DDC. Thanks again for listening. And if you aren't already subscribed, please go ahead and do so. And of course, press the like button if you've enjoyed this video. Have yourself a great day.